The notice went up at sunrise on the courthouse wall in Prosperity Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1867, and by noon, every soul in town had read it. Judge Harrison Whitmore had sentenced his only daughter to a fate worse than prison. Charlotte May. Whitmore, age 19, would marry the first unmarried man who claimed her within the week. Beggar or drunkard, Yankee or rebel, it made no difference. The judge had signed his name, bold as a cattle brand. Two Union veterans stood reading the notice, whiskey fumes rolling off them like morning fog. The taller one, Jenkins, had lost an eye at Antietam and wore a leather patch that gave him the look of a tired pirate. The shorter Dawson still walked with a limp from Gettysburg and carried a flask that never seemed to empty. "Would you look at that?" Jenkins said, tapping the notice with a dirty fingernail. "The high and mighty judge is selling his own flesh and blood." Dawson took a pull from his flask and grinned. $5 says she ends up with some filthy reb just to spite the old man. Whitmore would rather die than have Confederate blood in his family. 10 says she gets old Pete, the stable hand. Man hasn't bathed since Sumter fell. They laughed, the sound echoing down the dusty main street of Prosperity Creek, a town that had seen little prosperity since the war ended. Their laughter faded as a man approached his steps, measured and quiet. Thomas Becket stood before the notice, his face still as creek water in winter. Not a flicker crossed his features as he read the judge's proclamation. His clothes were plain but clean. A cotton shirt washed so often, the blue had faded to the color of distant mountains, canvas trousers worn smooth at the knees, boots polished despite their age. At 32, he carried himself with a military straightness that his current position as a stable hand at Henderson's livery couldn't disguise. Jenkins nudged Dawson. "Speak of the devil, looking to improve your station in life, Reb." Thomas didn't flinch at the slur, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd been called worse. When he turned away from the notice, his green eyes revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Good day, gentlemen," he said, his Virginia accent softened, but still present after years in the West. Dawson spat on the ground near Thomas's boots. "Ain't nothing good about sharing air with traitors." Thomas walked away, ignoring their taunts as he had learned to do. The war had been over for 2 years, but in places like Prosperity Creek, it still raged in hearts and minds. He returned to the livery, where the horses at least didn't care which side of the Mason-Dixon line he'd been born on. As he worked memories, he tried to keep buried rows unbidden, the thunderous artillery at Gettysburg, the screams of the wounded, the field hospital, where he had served as a captain in the Confederate Medical Corps. He remembered the faces of men he'd saved, blue uniforms and gray alike. He remembered the court-martial, the stripping of his rank, the accusations of treason for treating Union soldiers with the same care as Confederate ones. He still carried a gold pocket watch, the only possession from his former life, as the son of General William Becket of Virginia. Sometimes in the quiet of night, he opened it to read the inscription, "To serve with honor is to live with honor." His father's words spoken at his graduation from medical school in Philadelphia, before states chose sides and family turned against family. Charlotte May. Whitmore stood at her bedroom window watching as people gathered around the courthouse to read her sentence. Her hands trembled, but she kept her chin high, a habit her mother had drilled into her since childhood. "A Whitmore never shows weakness," Elizabeth Whitmore had said countless times, even as her own spirit withered under her husband's iron rule. At 19, Charlotte possessed a beauty that turned heads, honey gold hair, intelligent blue eyes, a determined chin. But it was her mind that set her apart in Prosperity Creek. She read voraciously, spoke her opinions with clarity, and had been taught by her mother in subjects ranging from literature to basic medicine. Such education was considered unnecessary, even dangerous for a woman, but Elizabeth had insisted, perhaps seeing in her daughter the freedom she herself had never known. A week ago, Charlotte had committed the unforgivable sin of refusing Samuel Hartley's marriage proposal. Samuel of the gold watch chain and cruel eyes, Samuel, whose father owned the bank and half the businesses in town. Samuel, who had been a lieutenant colonel in the Union Army and now paraded his war stories like banners. She had refused him publicly in her father's parlor with the town's most prominent citizens as witnesses. She could still see Samuel's face, the shock giving way to cold rage. "You'll regret this, Charlotte," he'd said quietly for her ears alone. "No one refuses a Hartley." Her father's reaction had been worse. Judge Harrison Whitmore, tall and imposing at 60, with silver hair and eyes like flint, had waited until the guests departed before unleashing his fury. "You foolish, ungrateful girl," he'd thundered. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The Hartley connection would have secured our position in this territory for generations." "I don't love him, Father," Charlotte had said, knowing it was futile. "I've seen how he treats those he considers beneath him." Love. The judge had laughed a sound without mirth. Marriage isn't about love. It's about alliances, about power, about continuing the family name with the right kind of blood. The Hartleys are one of us Union loyalists, people of quality. Samuel beat a former slave last month for looking him in the eye. Is that your definition of quality? The slap had come swiftly, stinging her cheek. "You will not speak to me this way. The war may be over, but some people need to remember their place." The next morning, the notice appeared. Her father's unique brand of justice, public humiliation, wrapped in legal trappings. Men had come to the Whitmore house in the days that followed. Farmers with calloused hands and nervous smiles. Shopkeepers sweating in their Sunday suits. Even Jenkins and Dawson had shown up reeking of whiskey and bravado. Judge Whitmore had turned each away with cutting remarks and cold stares, but not out of mercy for his daughter. Charlotte knew he was waiting for the perfect candidate to deliver the lesson he intended, someone whose very presence in the family would be a daily reminder of her defiance. On the 7th day, as the deadline approached, Thomas Becket arrived at the Whitmore home. Charlotte watched from the window as he tied his horse, not Henderson's livery horse, but a lean chestnut mare that moved with the same quiet grace as its owner. He wore a clean black coat that had seen better days, a white shirt buttoned to the collar, and carried a hat in his hands. He looked like what he was, a man of modest means, but undeniable dignity. Judge Whitmore received him in the parlor where Charlotte was summoned to stand like an exhibit in court. "You wish to marry my daughter?" the judge asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Yes, sir," Thomas answered, his accent immediately marking him as Southern. "And you are—" "Thomas Becket, sir. I work at Henderson's livery." The judge's eyes narrowed. "A stable hand. How appropriate." He studied Thomas with cold calculation. "You fought in the war, Mr. Becket." "I did, sir." "For the Confederacy, I presume, given your accent." "Yes, sir. I served in Virginia." A smile spread across the judge's face, and Charlotte felt a chill. This was what he had been waiting for, a former Confederate, a man who represented everything her father despised. "Well then, Mr. Becket, I believe we have our match." He turned to Charlotte. "Do you have any objections, daughter? This may be your only opportunity to speak before the wedding." Charlotte looked at Thomas Becket, seeing for the first time the intelligence in his green eyes, the controlled strength in his posture. She had noticed him around town quiet and solitary, doing his work efficiently, avoiding trouble. She had never heard him engage in the drunken Southern revanchism some former Confederates still displayed. He seemed contained, as if holding something valuable inside. Better a stranger who showed restraint than Samuel Hartley, with his practiced charm concealing cruelty. "I have no objection, Father," she said steadily. The judge's smile faltered momentarily, disappointed by her composure. "Very well. The wedding will take place tomorrow at noon. I've already spoken with Reverend Walsh." He turned to Thomas. "Be at the church on time, Mr. Beckett, and understand that while the law will recognize this marriage, you will never be welcome in this house." "I understand, sir," Thomas replied with a formality that seemed to come from long practice. "I'll provide for her to the best of my ability." "See that you do. A Southern gentleman's word should be worth something even after defeat." If the barb struck home, Thomas gave no sign. He bowed slightly to Charlotte, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "Until tomorrow, Miss Whitmore." After he left, Charlotte's mother entered the parlor, her steps hesitant as always in her husband's presence. "Harrison, are you certain about this? The man is a stranger." "He is exactly what Charlotte deserves," the judge replied coldly. "She refused the son of a Union officer to associate with rebel sympathizers. Now she can marry one and live with the consequences." What the judge didn't see was the fleeting look that passed between mother and daughter. Elizabeth's silent apology, Charlotte's equally silent absolution. Some battles couldn't be won. They could only be survived. The church bell rang solemnly at noon the next day, as if announcing a funeral rather than a wedding. Charlotte walked up the steps on legs that felt carved from wood, wearing a simple gray dress rather than white. No veil covered her face. She would meet this day directly. Her mother walked beside her, a silent support in the absence of the father who should have given her away, but instead sat stone-faced in the front pew. Inside the church smelled of pine oil and dust. Reverend Walsh, a thin man with disapproving eyes, waited at the altar with an expression that suggested he was conducting business he found distasteful but necessary. A few townspeople sat in the back, drawn by the spectacle of Judge Whitmore's public punishment of his daughter. And there was Thomas Beckett standing straight as a pine tree, wearing the same black coat from yesterday, his chestnut hair neatly combed, his face clean-shaven. He turned as Charlotte approached, and in his eyes she saw not triumph or lust or cruelty, but a steady resolve that somehow calmed her racing heart. The ceremony was brief and cold. No prayers for happiness, no celebration of union, only the legal words necessary to bind two strangers together. When Thomas slipped a simple gold band on her finger where he had gotten it on a stable hand's wages, she couldn't imagine his hands were warm and steady. His "I do" was quiet, but firm. When Charlotte's turn came, she looked not at Reverend Walsh, but at Thomas Beckett. "I do," she said, and meant at least this: "I do choose you over what waits for me otherwise." "You may kiss your bride." Reverend Walsh said the words mechanical. Thomas did not reach for her lips. Instead, he took her hand and pressed a light kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly gentle it nearly broke her composure. There was no possession in the touch, only respect. Judge Whitmore signed the marriage document with a harsh flourish and handed Thomas a small purse. "Her dowry," he said. "Such as it is, she is your responsibility now, Mr. Beckett. I wash my hands of the matter." "I understand, sir," Thomas replied, but the slight tightening of his jaw suggested he had his own thoughts on the judge's version of paternal duty. They walked out of the church as husband and wife, into a spring day that felt colder than the numbers on the thermometer suggested. Thomas helped Charlotte into a wagon hitched to his chestnut mare. Her trunk had already been loaded. The judge had planned every detail of her exile. As they pulled away, Charlotte saw her mother standing on the church steps, a handkerchief pressed to her lips. She did not wave. Judge Whitmore had already turned away. His point made his daughter punished. The road out of town ran between greening fields still showing scars from years of neglect during the war. Neither spoke for a time, the silence broken only by the creak of wheels and the soft rhythm of the horses' hooves. Thomas finally broke the silence as they crested a small hill. "It's not far," he said, his voice gentle. "Just beyond that stand of cottonwoods." He hesitated. "It's not much, but it's clean and sound. The roof doesn't leak. There's good water from the well." He sounded like a man laying out simple truths, neither apologizing nor boasting. Facts you could stand on. The house came into view as they rounded a bend, a small cabin built of squared logs with a stone chimney set on a gentle rise overlooking a creek. A narrow porch wrapped around two sides, a vegetable garden sprouted in neat rows, and a small corral stood ready for the mare. It was modest, but meticulously maintained with none of the disrepair common to bachelor dwellings. Inside, Charlotte found the same careful attention to detail. The main room held a table with two chairs, a small cook stove, a rocking chair by the hearth, and bookshelves made of rough boards but sanded smooth. A curtain separated this room from what must be the bedroom, while a ladder led to a small loft. Thomas carried her trunk inside and set it down carefully. "The bedroom is there," he said, eyes on the floor now rather than her face. "I'll sleep in the loft." Charlotte stared at him, surprised. "We are married," she said carefully. "By law, yes." He met her eyes, then direct and honest. "But I don't take what isn't freely given, Mrs. Beckett. A forced marriage is still force." He did not press further, simply hung his coat on a peg by the door. "I need to see to the mare. There's coffee in the tin by the stove if you'd like some." After he left, Charlotte explored the small cabin with growing curiosity. The bookshelves held a surprise, a dozen well-worn books, mostly medical texts, but also some literature. Dickens' Hawthorne, even a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. On a shelf near the bed sat a small wooden box carved with wildflowers, exquisitely detailed work that spoke of patient hands and artistic sensitivity. By the time Thomas returned, Charlotte had put away her few belongings and was sitting in the rocking chair, one of his medical books open in her lap. She saw his momentary expression of alarm before he controlled it. "You can read?" she asked directly. He stood in the doorway, caught between truth and the persona he had cultivated. "Yes," he finally said. "I can read. Yet you let people believe you're uneducated. It's easier that way. People are more comfortable when you meet their expectations." "And what do you expect of me, Mr. Beckett?" she asked, closing the book. He considered her question seriously. "I expect you'll be unhappy here at least for a time. I expect you'll miss your home, your mother. I expect you might resent me as part of your father's punishment." He moved to put more wood in the stove. "What I hope is that you'll find some peace here. No one will force you to do anything against your will as long as I have breath in my body. Why did you agree to this marriage? You must know what people will say, that you sought to improve your station by marrying the judge's daughter." Thomas's expression darkened slightly. "Let them talk. They will regardless." He poured himself a cup of coffee, the movements precise. "Would you prefer I had left you to whatever man might have claimed you by sundown? Your father made his intentions clear. This was ending today one way or another." You haven't answered my question. Thomas sighed and sat at the table cradling the coffee cup in hands that showed the marks of hard work, but also a surgeon's care in their clean-trimmed nails. I've seen you in town. How you speak to everyone with the same courtesy, whether they're bankers or former slaves. How you slipped Mrs. Patterson's boy an extra penny for candy when you thought no one was looking. He looked up at her. I saw your face when you refused Samuel Hartley. That took courage. Charlotte felt exposed as if he had read pages of her diary. You've been watching me. I observe. Old habit. He took a sip of coffee. Your father thinks he's punished you by giving you to a southern stable hand. Perhaps he has. But while I'm not what you would have chosen, I can promise you'll be safe here. As darkness fell across the prairie, Thomas lit the lamps and showed her how to bank the fire for the night. He climbed to the loft with a blanket and a book, leaving her the bedroom with its narrow bed and handmade quilt. Charlotte lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night coyotes calling in the distance, wind whispering through cottonwood leaves, the occasional creak of timber as the cabin settled. Above her, she could hear the soft sound of pages turning as Thomas read by lamplight. The day had begun with her sentence being carried out, yet she felt the first fragile tendril of something unexpected taking root. Not happiness, not yet, but perhaps a reprieve from fear. The bars of her cage had changed shape, but for the first time she could see space between them, room to breathe, to move, perhaps even to fly. In the loft, Thomas closed his book and extinguished his lamp. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight he had kept his first promise to himself. Charlotte Whitmore, no Charlotte. Beckett now was safe under his roof. Whatever came next, he would face it, with the same steady resolve that had carried him through war disgrace and the long, quiet years of rebuilding a life from ashes. Dawn broke with crimson fingers stretching across the eastern sky. Thomas Beckett was already awake, moving quietly through the cabin as Charlotte slept. He had years of practice, rising before the sun first as a military surgeon, when the wounded couldn't wait for daylight, then as a stable hand whose duties began with first light. He kindled the fire in the cook stove, set coffee to boil, and slipped outside to tend to the mare and the small flock of chickens that scratched in the yard. When he returned, Charlotte was standing by the window, her honey gold hair loose around her shoulders, watching him with thoughtful eyes. "Good morning," he said, removing his hat, as he entered, a gesture of respect so automatic it revealed his upbringing more clearly than words could. "Coffee's hot." "Thank you." And she poured herself a cup, adding a spoonful of precious sugar from the small jar on the shelf. "Do you always rise so early?" "Most days." He hung his hat on its peg. "Henderson expects me at the livery by 6. There are horses to be fed and stalls to be mucked before the freight wagons head out." Charlotte nodded, sipping her coffee. "And what should I do while you're gone?" The question hung between them, practical yet laden with meaning. What was her role in this strange arrangement? Was she meant to be a housekeeper? A silent presence? Or something else entirely? Thomas considered his words carefully. "Whatever you wish. The garden needs tending, and the chickens need feeding around noon. But beyond that," he gestured to the bookshelves, "read, rest. I know yesterday was difficult." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You're very accommodating for a man who suddenly has a wife. And you're very composed for a woman who suddenly has a husband not of her choosing." His lips quirked slightly. "We're both making the best of unusual circumstances, Mrs. Beckett." The name still sounded foreign to her ears. Charlotte Beckett. A name forced upon her, yet oddly not as distasteful as it might have been. "Will you be home for the midday meal?" she asked, moving toward practicalities. "No, I bring something with me." He hesitated. "I'll return after sundown. Henderson works me until the light fails." After he left, Charlotte explored the cabin more thoroughly, opening cupboards and examining the root cellar dug beneath the floor. The pantry was modestly stocked flour beans, salt pork, coffee, some preserves. A hunter's rifle hung on pegs above the door, clean and oiled. In the bedroom, she discovered a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, locked with a small brass key. She wasn't ordinarily one to pry, but these were extraordinary circumstances. She was living with a stranger who was now her husband, a man who claimed to be a simple stable hand, yet owned medical texts and spoke with an educated cadence when he forgot to guard his words. A search of the cabin revealed no key. Charlotte felt a momentary guilt quickly replaced by determination. She had been thrust into this man's life without choice. Surely she deserved to know with whom she was sharing a home. Using a hairpin, a trick her mother's maid had taught her years ago, she managed to spring the lock. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, lay the evidence of another life. A Confederate officer's gray coat, with captain's insignia and medical corps badges, surgical instruments of fine quality, a journal bound in leather, and a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. At the bottom, a daguerreotype in a silver frame showed a younger Thomas in uniform standing beside an older man with the same green eyes, wearing a general's stars. She almost closed the chest, then feeling she had intruded too far, but curiosity drew her to the journal. The handwriting inside was precise, a doctor's practice script detailing battlefield injuries, treatments, successes, and failures. Thomas had been a surgeon, and by all accounts a skilled one. Entries spoke of operating through bombardments, of treating Union prisoners with the same care as Confederate soldiers, of arguing with superiors who wanted to prioritize their own men. The final entries documented his court-martial. He had been accused of providing aid and comfort to the enemy, of wasting Confederate resources on Union wounded. Thomas had defended himself with a surgeon's oath to treat all who suffered regardless of uniform. He was stripped of his rank, but spared imprisonment due to testimony from soldiers on both sides who owed him their lives. Charlotte closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. She had married not a simple stable hand, but a man with a past as complex as the country itself, a Confederate officer who had risked his career and freedom to uphold his medical oath. She carefully repacked the chest, locked it, and returned the key to its hiding place, her mind whirling with this new knowledge. In town, Thomas worked with steady concentration, losing himself in the rhythm of physical labor. Henderson was a hard taskmaster, expecting every horse to be groomed to perfection, every stall to be spotless. The pay was poor, but it was honest work that allowed Thomas to maintain his small homestead and keep to himself. "Here you got yourself a wife, Beckett," Henderson remarked around midday, chewing on a wad of tobacco. "Judge's daughter, no less. How did a Reb stable hand manage that trick?" Thomas continued, brushing down a bay gelding, his strokes even and methodical. "Judge Whitmore had his reasons." Henderson spat a stream of brown juice into the dirt. "Punishment, more like. Town's talking about nothing else. Samuel Hartley's fit to be tied. Says you stole what was his." "Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Beckett doesn't belong to anyone," Thomas said quietly, but with an edge that made Henderson eye him more carefully. "Didn't take you for a fool, Beckett, but crossing Hartley's a fool's game. Man's got influence and a mean streak wide as the Missouri." Thomas said nothing, but his jaw tightened slightly. He knew Samuel Hartley's type all too well, men who wore their war service like a crown, who confused victory with virtue, who believed their cause's triumph gave them license over the defeated. He had treated too many wounds inflicted by such men, both on and off the battlefield. By late afternoon, Thomas was loading supplies onto a freight wagon when he noticed a commotion near the general store across the street. A small crowd had gathered, voices raised in anger. At the center stood Samuel Hartley, his hand gripping the collar of a black man who knelt in the dust. "Look at me when I address you," Hartley was saying, his voice carrying across the street. He wore a fine coat, despite the spring warmth, a gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. "You were given your freedom, not your equality. Remember that." The black man. Thomas recognized him as Isaiah Washington, who did odd jobs around town, kept his eyes downcast. "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. Sorry isn't enough. Someone needs to teach you your place." Hartley's hand moved to his belt, unbuckling it with deliberate slowness. Thomas set down the feed sack he was carrying and crossed the street, ignoring Henderson's warning call. He moved through the crowd, which parted uncertainly before him. "Mr. Hartley," he said, his voice level. "There's no need for this." Hartley turned his handsome face, twisting with disdain, when he recognized Thomas. "This isn't your concern, Beckett. Get back to shoveling manure where you belong. The war's over, sir. This man's done nothing to warrant a beating." "He looked me in the eye, like we were equals," Hartley said, belt now in hand. "Some lessons need to be taught repeatedly." Thomas stepped between Hartley and Isaiah Washington. "I believe the law applies equally now, regardless of color. Judge Whitmore might have something to say about public disturbances." At the mention of the judge, uncertainty flickered across Hartley's face. His new connection to the town's judicial authority was a card Thomas hadn't expected to play, but he wouldn't hesitate to use any advantage to prevent violence. "The judge," Hartley said with a cold smile, "has made his opinion of you quite clear, Beckett. Do you really think he'd side with a rebel sympathizer over me?" "Perhaps not," Thomas conceded. "But he is a man who respects the law, however selectively he might apply it. And the law no longer permits what you're intending." The crowd watched the exchange with tense anticipation. Most were former Union supporters or had moved west to avoid the conflict altogether. Few would openly side with Thomas, yet there was discomfort on some faces at Hartley's display. Hartley glanced around, gauging his audience. A public beating might satisfy his anger, but it could also tarnish the respectable image he cultivated. He lowered his belt and stepped closer to Thomas, speaking for his ears alone. "You may wear my leavings like a victory, Beckett, but we both know what Charlotte is damaged goods I no longer wanted. Enjoy my cast-offs." He turned away, calling over his shoulder, "You there, Washington? I expect you to remember your manners next time." Isaiah Washington rose shakily to his feet as the crowd dispersed. Only when Hartley and his friends were well away did he speak. "Didn't need to do that, Mr. Beckett. Only makes trouble for you." "I've seen enough men beaten for no reason," Thomas replied quietly. "Once you start accepting it as normal, you've lost something you can't get back." Washington studied him with new interest. "You're not what folks say you are you?" Thomas merely shook his head and returned to the livery, aware that he had drawn unwanted attention. Henderson gave him additional tasks as punishment for leaving work, ensuring he wouldn't return home until well after dark. Charlotte had spent the day exploring the boundaries of her new life. She tended the garden, noting Thomas's careful organization of herbs and vegetables. She fed the chickens and collected 4 brown eggs warm in her palm. She baked bread in the small cook stove, the familiar task grounding her in the strangeness of her circumstances. But her mind kept returning to the contents of the locked chest. Thomas Beckett, Confederate surgeon, son of a general now living as a simple stable hand in a town that would despise him if they knew his full story. What had driven him to such a life? Why conceal his education and skills in a territory desperate for medical knowledge? When Thomas finally returned, dusk had deepened into true night. He moved stiffly, fatigue evident in every line of his body. "I apologize for the late hour," he said, removing his hat. Henderson required additional work. "There's stew," Charlotte replied, gesturing to the pot keeping warm on the stove, "and fresh bread." Surprise and something like gratitude crossed his features. "Thank you." As he washed up at the basin by the door, Charlotte noticed dark bruising on his knuckles. "You're hurt." Thomas glanced at his hand, as if noticing the injury for the first time. "It's nothing." A horse shifted unexpectedly. She didn't believe him. A man who had been a surgeon would be more careful with his hands. But she said nothing as she ladled stew into a bowl and set it before him along with a thick slice of bread. They ate in silence for a time, the day's tensions hovering unspoken between them. Finally, Charlotte set down her spoon. "I heard there was trouble in town today." Thomas's eyes flicked up to meet hers wary. "News travels fast." "Mrs. Henderson came by with eggs this afternoon. She mentioned her husband was upset that you'd intervened in business that wasn't yours." Charlotte kept her voice neutral. "She seemed quite impressed, actually. Said you stood up to Samuel Hartley when he was about to beat a colored man." Thomas concentrated on his stew. "I did what anyone should have done." "But no one else did." They stood and watched. She studied him across the table. "Is that why you came west after the war? Because you couldn't stand by and watch cruelty happen?" His spoon stilled. "You've been busy today, Mrs. Beckett." "Charlotte," she corrected. "If we're to live together, we might at least use our given names." Thomas nodded slightly, acknowledging the small olive branch. "Charlotte, then." "You haven't answered my question." He set his spoon down, his green eyes meeting hers directly. "What exactly are you asking?" "I found the chest," she said simply. For a long moment, he said nothing, his face unreadable. Then he pushed his half-finished bowl aside and leaned back in his chair. "I see." "I apologize for the intrusion," Charlotte added, "but I believe I have a right to know who I've married." A flash of something anger-resignation, perhaps both, crossed his features before he controlled it. "Yes, I suppose you do." He stood and moved to the shelf where he kept a bottle of whiskey, pouring a small measure into a cup. He offered it to her, but she shook her head. "Captain Thomas Beckett, Confederate Medical Corps," he said, taking a sip. "Court-martialed in 1864 for providing excessive care to Union prisoners stripped of rank, narrowly avoided imprisonment. Son of General William Beckett of Virginia, who disowned me for betraying the cause. Graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia." His voice had taken on a formal, almost report-like quality. "Is that what you wanted to know, Charlotte? Why hide it? Doctors are needed everywhere in the territories." Thomas gave a humorless smile. "A Confederate doctor in a Union-sympathizing town." He shook his head. "I tried practicing after the war in Missouri first. Had my office burned down when they learned where I'd served. Tried again in Kansas. Was beaten so badly I couldn't use my right hand for months. The third time I decided it was simpler to be Thomas Beckett Stablehand. No one looks too closely at a man who shovels manure for a living." Charlotte felt a pang of sympathy, quickly followed by indignation. "So instead, your skills go to waste. People suffer who might be helped." "I didn't say that." Thomas finished his whiskey and set the cup down carefully. "I do what I can quietly. There's a cabin in the woods beyond the north pasture. People who need help find their way there." "People like Isaiah Washington," Charlotte guessed. Thomas nodded. "And others, former slaves, Indians, passing through, anyone who can't go to the town doctor because of money or skin color or old hatreds." His expression softened slightly. I haven't abandoned my oath, Charlotte. I've just learned to fulfill it more carefully. She considered this, seeing him in a new light, not just a man hiding his past, but one still trying to honor the best parts of it despite the cost. And now you have a wife who knows your secret, she said. What will you do about that? He studied her for a long moment. That depends on what you intend to do with the information. I could expose you, she said, testing him. Tell my father the town. You could, he agreed, his voice level. And I would leave, start over somewhere else as I've done before. Or you could keep my confidence and I'll keep yours. Charlotte frowned. What confidence of mine do you keep, that you're not nearly as resigned to your fate as you pretend to be? That you watched Samuel Hartley with revulsion long before you refused him? That you're planning something escape, perhaps, or some other form of rebellion against your father's sentence? His green eyes held hers steadily. I recognize the look of someone calculating their options, Charlotte. I've worn it myself. She felt exposed, as if he had read pages not meant for his eyes. And you would let me go if I chose to leave? I would, Thomas said simply. I meant what I said yesterday. I don't take what isn't freely given. That includes your presence in this house. A silence fell between them, not entirely uncomfortable. Outside, an owl called into the night, and the wind rustled through the cottonwoods. I'm not planning to leave, Charlotte said finally. Not yet, at least. And I won't expose your secret. Relief flickered briefly across his face. Thank you. On one condition. She leaned forward, her decision made. Teach me. I've read your medical texts, but reading isn't the same as doing. If you're treating patients in secret, you could use an assistant. Surprise replaced relief. It could be dangerous for you. If your father found out, my father has already done his worst, she interrupted. What more can he take from me? She rose and began clearing the table, a practical gesture to match her practical request. Besides, my mother taught me basic nursing. I'm not entirely ignorant. Thomas watched her move about the cabin, this unexpected woman who had been thrust into his life and was now proposing to enter the most private part of it. We'll start tomorrow evening, he said quietly. After my work at the livery. Charlotte nodded, satisfaction warming her. It wasn't freedom exactly, but it was purpose, something more meaningful than being merely Judge Whitmore's disgraced daughter or Thomas Beckett's unwanted wife. That night, as she lay in bed listening to Thomas move about in the loft above, Charlotte felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't expected. Not contentment precisely, but a sense of possibility. Her father had meant to break her spirit by forcing this marriage. Instead, he may have inadvertently opened a door to a life with more substance than the one she had left behind. The small woodland cabin was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace built of rough logs and roofed with cedar shakes that Thomas had split himself. Inside, he had created a simple but functional clinic, a narrow bed for patients, shelves of medicines and herbs, a table for examinations, and a small workbench where he prepared tinctures and poultices. It's not much, he said as he lit the lamps, but it serves its purpose. Charlotte moved through the space, taking in the neat organization, the carefully labeled bottles, the instruments kept clean and ready. How many patients do you see here? It varies. Word spreads quietly among those who need help. They know to come after dark, to leave no obvious trails. He removed his coat and rolled up his shirt sleeves. There's a pregnant woman coming tonight. Creek Indian, married to a white trapper. The town doctor refused to see her. Because she's Indian? Thomas nodded. And because her husband can't pay in cash, only in pelts, he began setting out instruments, his movements efficient. She's near her time, but the baby is positioned poorly. I felt it last week when she came. What will you do? Try to turn the child if possible. If not, his expression grew grave. We may face harder choices. Charlotte removed her shawl and hung it by the door. Tell me how I can help. For the next hour, Thomas taught her how to prepare the cabin for the birth, boiling water to sterilize instruments, laying out clean cloths, mixing a tincture of willow bark for pain. His instructions were clear and precise, his manner shifting subtly from the reserved stable hand to the confident surgeon he had once been. How did you learn all this? Charlotte asked as they worked. Medical school teaches the basics, but this seems beyond that. War is a brutal teacher, Thomas replied, checking the edge on a small knife. You learn quickly or men die. I assisted in more surgeries during my first month at Manassas than most doctors perform in years of practice. He set the knife down, and I read. Every medical journal I can find, every new technique. Just because I live as a stable hand doesn't mean I've abandoned medicine. Before Charlotte could respond, a soft knock came at the door. Thomas opened it to reveal a tall white man with a weathered face and a young Creek woman, her pregnant belly straining against a homespun dress. The woman's face was tense with pain, her dark eyes wide with fear. She started early, Doc, the man said anxiously. Been having pains since yesterday, but they got bad this afternoon. Bring her in, Mr. Collins, Thomas said, his voice calm and reassuring. He turned to the woman. Evening, Sarah. Let's have a look at you and the little one. As Charlotte watched Thomas, transformed completely. Gone was any trace of the subservient stable hand, replaced by a physician whose quiet authority filled the small cabin. He spoke gently to Sarah, explaining each step before touching her, monitoring her contractions with practiced hands. The baby has shifted, he told Charlotte, after examining Sarah. Still breech, but not as badly positioned as last week. I believe we can deliver safely if we're careful. For the next several hours, Charlotte worked alongside Thomas, following his instructions, learning as they went. She held Sarah's hand through contractions, bathed her forehead with cool cloths, translated Thomas's medical terminology into simple reassurances. When the moment of birth arrived, she supported Sarah's shoulders while Thomas guided the baby into the world with skilled hands that showed no trace of their daily labor with horses and hay. A daughter, Thomas announced as the infant's cry filled the cabin. He worked quickly to clear the baby's airways, then placed her on Sarah's chest. She's perfect, Sarah. Well done. The look of wonder on the young mother's face as she held her child struck Charlotte deeply. This moment, a new life safely delivered despite all obstacles, was something sacred, something that transcended the divisions of North and South, white and Indian past and present. Later, as Thomas instructed Mr. Collins on caring for his wife and newborn daughter, Charlotte cleaned the instruments and packed away the unused supplies. She felt changed by what she had witnessed, not just the birth itself, but Thomas in his element, using his gifts without constraint or pretense. The couple left just before dawn, Mr. Collins carrying his bundled wife and child in his arms, his face transformed by gratitude. "Don't know how to thank you, Doc," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Anything you ever need from me or mine, just ask." "He'll take good care of them," Thomas replied simply. "That's thanks enough." When they had gone, Charlotte sank into a chair, exhaustion finally claiming her. "Do all your patients leave so grateful?" Thomas smiled faintly as he washed his hands in a basin of water. "Not all outcomes are so happy. But yes, gratitude is common when you treat people who expect to be turned away." He dried his hands on a clean cloth. "You did well tonight, Charlotte. You have a natural calm that patients respond to. I've never seen anything like it, she admitted. The miracle of it, even after all your years of experience. Especially after all my years of experience, Thomas corrected gently. I've seen too much death not to be awed by life. He began packing his medical bag. We should head back before it's fully light. People will talk if they see us returning together at dawn. As they walked through the woods toward home, the eastern sky lightening to pearl, Charlotte felt a new respect for the man beside her. He had lost everything, rank, family, profession, yet continued to serve others at great personal risk. There was a quiet nobility in that choice that she couldn't help but admire. "Will you teach me more?" she asked as the cabin came into view. "Not just assisting, but diagnosis treatment." Thomas glanced at her surprise, evident in his expression. "You want to learn medicine?" "Is that so strange? My mother taught me what she knew, but it was limited. You have knowledge that could help people, knowledge I could help spread." He was silent for a long moment, considering. "It won't be easy. There's much to learn, and mistakes can be costly." "I understand. And it must remain our secret. If Henderson heard I was practicing medicine, or your father learned you were assisting me—" "I can keep secrets, Thomas. I've had practice." She paused at the edge of their clearing. "Will you teach me?" The rising sun caught in her honey-gold hair, illuminating her determined expression. Thomas felt something shift within him, a recognition that perhaps fate had sent him not just a wife in name, but a partner in his clandestine work. "Yes," he said finally. "I'll teach you." They reached the cabin just as the sun cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. A new day beginning, and with it, a new understanding between them. Neither noticed the figure watching from the distant tree line, Samuel Hartley, who had followed Thomas from town the previous evening, whose cold eyes had observed their nighttime journey to the woodland cabin, and whose jealousy now burned with dangerous intensity. The weeks that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. By day, Thomas worked at Henderson's livery, mucking stalls and shoeing horses with the careful anonymity of a man who wished to remain unremarkable. Charlotte tended their small homestead, growing into the role of frontier wife with a quiet determination that surprised even herself. Nights were divided between their home, where Thomas taught her from his medical texts by lamplight, and the woodland cabin where patients increasingly found their way. Word spread cautiously among those the town physician wouldn't treat former slaves like Isaiah Washington, Native Americans from nearby settlements, poor white farmers who couldn't afford Dr. Miller's fees. They came with broken bones, infected wounds, difficult pregnancies, childhood illnesses. Thomas treated them all with the same methodical care, and Charlotte learned at his side, her quick mind absorbing his teachings, her hands growing steadier with each procedure. It was a strange double life, yet one that brought them gradually closer. They still maintained their separate sleeping arrangements. Thomas in the loft, Charlotte in the bedroom, but the awkwardness between them eased as they found common purpose in their secret work. On a warm evening in late May, they sat on the porch after dinner, the sunset painting the western sky in bands of gold and crimson. Charlotte was grinding herbs for a fever remedy, the pestle moving in rhythmic circles against the mortar. Thomas sat cleaning his surgical instruments, his hands moving with the precision that marked everything he did. "Mrs. Patterson told me today that Samuel Hartley has been asking questions about us," Charlotte said, not looking up from her task. "About where we go at night." Thomas's hands stilled momentarily. "What sort of questions? Whether we're often away from home after dark? Whether you've been seen treating injuries?" She set the mortar down, meeting his eyes. "He suspects something. Hartley's a dangerous man to have as an enemy, Thomas said quietly. He has influence with your father, with the sheriff. Charlotte's jaw tightened. I won't be intimidated by him. What we're doing helps people who have nowhere else to turn. It also violates the territorial medical licensing laws and, in some eyes, the social order. Thomas resumed his work voice deliberately level. We need to be more careful. Different routes to the cabin, perhaps fewer nights there. And leave people suffering. Charlotte shook her head. There has to be another way. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was coming fast up the track to their cabin, his horse lathered with exertion. As he neared, they recognized Isaiah Washington, his face taut with urgency. Mr. Beckett, he called, reining his horse to a stop. Doc, you got to come quick. It's bad in town. Thomas was on his feet immediately. What's happened? People getting sick all over. High fevers, red rash, some having trouble breathing. Isaiah wiped sweat from his brow. Doc Miller's overwhelmed, and he ain't treating colored folk anyhow. 3 children already dead since yesterday. Thomas and Charlotte exchanged alarmed glances. Sounds like typhus, Thomas said, or scarlet fever. He turned back to Isaiah. How many sick? 20, maybe 30 that I know of. More by now, likely. Isaiah's voice cracked with emotion. My boy Elijah's burning up, Doc. 9 years old and strong as an ox yesterday. Now he can't hardly lift his head. Thomas was already moving, gathering his medical bag. I'll come now. Charlotte, I need you to prepare more fever remedy, as much willow bark tincture as we have. Meet me at the woodland cabin in 2 hours. I'm coming with you, she said firmly. You'll need help if there are that many ill. It's too dangerous. If your father sees you treating patients alongside me, then he'll finally see me doing something worthwhile, she interrupted. I'm not staying behind, Thomas, not with children dying. He recognized the steel in her voice, the same determination that had led her to refuse Samuel Hartley despite the consequences. He nodded once, accepting her decision. Bring the medical bag and the blue box of medicines from under the floorboard. I'll saddle the horses. Prosperity Creek was a town in the grip of fear. As they rode down the main street, Thomas and Charlotte saw closed shutters, empty boardwalks, and anxious faces peering from windows. Outside the small building that served as both doctor's office and town hall, a crowd had gathered. Worried parents holding feverish children, elderly people leaning heavily on younger relatives' faces etched with desperation. Dr. Miller, a stout man with mutton-chop whiskers and an air of harried importance, was addressing the crowd from the steps. I cannot treat everyone at once. Those with mild symptoms must return home and wait. Priority will be given to... He stopped abruptly as he spotted Thomas and Charlotte approaching. What business have you here, Beckett? Thomas dismounted, his manner respectful but direct. I've come to help Dr. Miller. I have some experience with fevers. Miller's face flushed with indignation. Experience a stable hand at presuming to offer medical assistance. This is preposterous. His gaze shifted to Charlotte. And you bring the judge's daughter into this sickness? Your disrespect knows no bounds. Before Thomas could respond, a woman pushed forward from the crowd. A child of about 4, limp in her arms. My boy's burning up, doctor, she pleaded. He ain't opened his eyes since morning. Miller barely glanced at the child. As I was saying, priority will be given to established patients with the most severe symptoms. Those without accounts must wait. That child needs immediate attention. Thomas interrupted, his calm voice carrying an authority that made heads turn. His breathing is labored, and the cyanosis around his lips indicates advanced infection. A murmur ran through the crowd. Miller's face darkened. "You presume to diagnose from horseback stable hand. Know your place." Charlotte slid from her saddle and moved to the woman's side, laying a gentle hand on the child's forehead. "He's right, Dr. Miller. This child is critically ill." She turned to Thomas. "The fever's very high, and his pulse is rapid, but weak." Miller spluttered, looking from Charlotte to Thomas with growing comprehension. "What is the meaning of this? Have you been practicing medicine without a license, Beckett, and corrupting the judge's daughter into your illegal activities?" Thomas ignored him, addressing the desperate mother. "Ma'am, your son needs immediate treatment. With your permission, I can help him." The woman looked frantically between Miller and Thomas, torn between social propriety and maternal instinct. "I don't understand you're the stable hand, but you talk like a doctor." "Because he is one," said a firm voice from the edge of the crowd. Heads turned to see Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife, stepping forward. "Captain Thomas Beckett, Confederate Medical Corps. He saved my brother's leg at Gettysburg and my nephew's life just last month when the boy had croup." A shocked silence fell. Thomas stood very still, feeling the weight of exposed truth after years of careful concealment. "A Confederate surgeon," Miller said with quiet venom, "a traitor to medicine itself, treating enemy soldiers while loyal men died, and now practicing without territorial license. He's a healer who treats everyone regardless of color or coin," Mrs. Patterson countered. She turned to the crowd. "Many of you know this already. Where did you think your children's fevers broke when you couldn't pay Dr. Miller? Who set Jacob Taylor's broken arm when he fell from the mill roof? Who delivered Sarah Collins's baby when no one else would touch an Indian woman?" More voices joined hers, people stepping forward with stories of quiet help received in desperate moments. Isaiah Washington stood tall among them, his dignity a rebuke to those who would dismiss him. "This is absurd," Miller blustered. "Sheriff Reed, this man should be arrested for practicing without a license." The sheriff, a weathered man with a perpetual frown, shifted uncomfortably. "Got more pressing matters than licenses right now, Doc. People are dying." The woman with the sick child made her decision, stepping toward Thomas. "Please," she said simply, "help my boy." Thomas nodded, once his eyes meeting Charlotte's. In that moment of silent communication, they both understood there was no going back from this public revelation. Whatever came after, they would face it together. "We'll need a place to work," Thomas said, taking the child gently from his mother's arms. "Somewhere clean, with good light and ventilation." "The church," suggested Reverend Walsh, who had been watching silently from the periphery. "It's the largest space we have, and empty now with services cancelled due to the sickness." Miller made one last attempt to assert authority. "This is highly irregular. I will report this to Judge Whitmore immediately." "Report all you like," Charlotte said, her voice steady. "But first help us move the most critical patients to the church. Unless you prefer to explain to my father why you obstructed treatment during an epidemic." Something in her tone, the unmistakable authority of a Whitmore woman giving orders, made even Miller hesitate. The crowd was already moving, organizing themselves to transport the ill, and the moment for effective protest had passed. Thomas carried the sick boy toward the church, Charlotte at his side with the medical bag. "Are you certain about this?" he asked quietly. "Once we start, there's no return to anonymity. Your father will know everything." Charlotte's chin lifted slightly. "I've never been more certain. This is what we're meant to do, Thomas. Not hide in shadows, but help openly when we're needed most." He studied her face, the determination, the compassion, the quiet strength that had grown over these weeks of working together. Something shifted in his chest, a recognition that this woman he had married in name only had become essential to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Then let's begin," he said simply. The church became an impromptu hospital within hours. Pews were pushed aside, makeshift beds arranged in rows, and every available lamp requisitioned to provide light. Thomas moved from patient to patient with methodical efficiency, diagnosing, treating, instructing those who volunteered to help. Charlotte worked alongside him, preparing medicines, changing compresses, monitoring the most critical cases. "It's typhoid fever," Thomas told her as they conferred briefly between patients. "The pattern of symptoms is unmistakable: the sustained high fever, the rose-colored spots on the abdomen, the intestinal symptoms." "Contaminated water," Charlotte suggested, wiping sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. "Most likely. The town well, perhaps, or the creek where children swim." He rubbed his eyes, fatigue evident in the lines of his face. "We need to boil all drinking water, isolate the worst cases, and find the source." Their quiet consultation was interrupted by the church doors swinging open with a bang. Judge Harrison Whitmore stood framed in the entrance, his imposing figure rigid with anger. Behind him, Samuel Hartley wore an expression of vindictive satisfaction. "Charlotte," the judge said, his voice cutting through the hushed sounds of the sick, "what is the meaning of this?" "This spectacle," Charlotte straightened, fatigue falling away as she faced her father. "We're treating the ill father. There's an epidemic of typhoid fever in town." "So I've heard. I've also heard that your husband has been revealed as a Confederate doctor practicing illegally." His cold gaze shifted to Thomas. "Deceiving the town, deceiving me, practicing medicine without proper authority. This ends now." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "With respect, sir, it cannot end until the epidemic is contained. These people need treatment." "They have Dr. Miller." "Dr. Miller is one man facing dozens of cases," Charlotte interjected, "and he refuses to treat anyone who can't pay or isn't white. People are dying, Father." The judge's expression hardened. "Your concern is noted, Charlotte, but this is a matter of law. Mr. Beckett has no legal right to practice medicine in this territory." "Then grant him one," she challenged. "You're the territorial judge. Issue an emergency authorization. Or are legal technicalities more important than children's lives?" A tense silence fell. Around them, the moans of the sick and the weeping of worried relatives continued a grim chorus, underscoring the confrontation. Samuel Hartley stepped forward, his handsome face arranged in an expression of reasonable concern. "Judge Whitmore, if I may, while the situation is certainly grave, we cannot allow every self-proclaimed healer to take advantage of public fear. How do we know Beckett's treatments won't do more harm than good? After all, his loyalties during the war were questionable at best." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "My medical training was at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Mr. Hartley. My oath as a physician transcends political boundaries. I treated soldiers of both sides during the war, because that was my duty as a doctor." "A duty your superiors found treasonous," Hartley countered smoothly. "Enough," Judge Whitmore said sharply. "Charlotte, gather your things. You're returning home with me immediately. Mr. Beckett will surrender himself to Sheriff Reed for questioning regarding unlicensed medical practice." Charlotte stood her ground. "I will do no such thing. I'm needed here." She moved to stand beside Thomas, her message clear: they were united in this. The judge's face darkened with anger. "You forget yourself, daughter. I am still the law in this territory, and—" His words were cut short as he swayed suddenly, one hand going to his temple. Samuel Hartley caught his arm, steadying him. "Judge, are you unwell?" "A momentary dizziness," the judge muttered. "The heat in here, the strain of the day." But Thomas had already moved forward, professional instinct overriding personal caution. "Sir, when did this start? Have you experienced headache, abdominal pain, fever?" "I don't require your attentions, Beckett," the judge snapped, but his voice lacked its usual force. Sweat beaded visibly on his forehead, and his complexion had taken on an unhealthy pallor. Charlotte stepped closer, concern replacing defiance. "Father, please, let Thomas examine you. Typhoid can progress rapidly, and early treatment—" "Preposterous," the judge interrupted, but his next words died as his knees buckled. Thomas and Hartley caught him before he could fall, lowering him to a nearby pew. "Get me a clean cloth and cold water," Thomas instructed Charlotte, his fingers already at the judge's wrist, counting the pulse. Professional detachment masked his features as he opened the judge's collar and pressed a hand to his forehead. "Rapid pulse, high fever. How long have you felt unwell, sir?" Judge Whitmore seemed to struggle against his own weakness. "Since yesterday. Thought it was just exhaustion. The town's been in an uproar with this sickness. Have you been drinking from the town well?" "Of course. My house is supplied from it." Thomas exchanged a significant glance with Charlotte as she returned with water and cloth. "The well is likely contaminated. You're showing early symptoms of typhoid, sir." "Nonsense," the judge protested, but his voice was weaker now. "Miller examined me just yesterday. Said it was mere fatigue." "Miller missed it," Thomas said bluntly, "as he's missed several cases, particularly in their early stages. The distinctive rash hasn't appeared yet, but your other symptoms are textbook." Hartley had backed away, watching with barely concealed alarm. "If the judge is ill, he should be taken home, attended by Dr. Miller." "Moving him now would be dangerous," Thomas interrupted, "and every hour matters with typhoid. Treatment must begin immediately." He looked directly at Judge Whitmore. "Sir, I understand your distrust of me, but I am asking you as a physician to let me treat you, if not for your own sake, then for your daughter's." A complex emotion crossed the judge's face as he looked at Charlotte, pride warring with fear, authority, with the fundamental human desire to live. What would this treatment entail? Cool baths to reduce the fever, specific medications to combat the infection, careful monitoring and supportive care. Thomas maintained his professional demeanor. "I won't lie to you, sir. Typhoid is serious, especially for a man of your age, but I've treated it successfully many times." The judge closed his eyes briefly, perhaps weighing his options, perhaps simply fighting against the fever's grip. When he opened them again, there was grudging resignation in his gaze. "Proceed, then, but under protest." Thomas nodded once, already turning to prepare the necessary medications. "Charlotte, we'll need to set up a bed for your father, somewhere quiet but easily accessible for monitoring." "The Reverend's study," she suggested. "It's private, but connected to the main church." As they worked to make the judge comfortable, Samuel Hartley pulled Charlotte aside, his voice low and urgent. "This is madness, Charlotte. Your father needs proper care, not the attentions of a disgraced Confederate surgeon. Let me take him to Dr. Miller." "Thomas is the best physician either of us will ever meet, Samuel," she replied coldly. "And unlike you, he doesn't measure a person's worth by their wealth or political allegiance." Hartley's handsome features hardened. "You've changed. The Charlotte I knew would never speak to me this way. The Charlotte you knew was a girl trying to please her father. The woman before you has seen what real courage and compassion look like." She pulled her arm from his grasp. "Now either help us treat the sick, or leave. We have work to do." Something dangerous flickered in Hartley's eyes, wounded pride, perhaps, or thwarted possession. "This isn't over, Charlotte. Your rebel doctor is still practicing without a license, still a traitor to his country. One case of typhoid won't change that." "Perhaps not, but it might change how people see him, and that's what truly bothers you, isn't it?" She turned away, dismissing him, to return to Thomas's side. Hartley watched her go, his expression darkening into something cold and calculating. Without another word, he left the church, striding purposefully toward the town center. Night fell on Prosperity Creek, but the improvised hospital in the church remained illuminated by dozens of lamps. Thomas moved tirelessly from patient to patient, his years of battlefield medicine evident in his stamina and focus. Charlotte worked equally hard, dividing her attention between the general ward and her father's private room, where the judge battled against fever with the same stern determination he brought to his courtroom. "How is he?" Thomas asked quietly, joining her as she changed the cool compress on her father's forehead. "The fever isn't breaking," she replied, worry evident in her voice, "and his breathing seems more labored." Thomas checked the judge's pulse, his expression carefully neutral. "The first days are often the worst. Keep him cool and ensure he drinks the willow bark tea whenever he's conscious." He hesitated, then added, "You should rest, Charlotte. You've been working for hours without a break." "So have you. I've had practice with long surgeries during the war. This isn't your first such crisis." She met his gaze steadily. "It's not a question of experience, but of will. These people need us. My father needs us." Thomas studied her face, noting the fatigue, but also the unwavering resolve. In the lamplight, with her honey-gold hair escaping its pins and her sleeves rolled up for practicality, she looked both vulnerable and indomitable. He felt a sudden powerful surge of admiration for this woman who had turned a forced marriage into an opportunity to do meaningful work, who faced adversity with grace and determination. "Very well," he conceded, "but promise you'll tell me if you need rest." Their moment of connection was interrupted by Reverend Walsh, who entered with an expression of grave concern. "Dr. Beckett, there's a problem. Sheriff Reed is outside with Samuel Hartley and several men. They're demanding to speak with you immediately." Thomas exchanged a glance with Charlotte. "Stay with your father. I'll handle this." Outside the church, Sheriff Reed stood awkwardly at the foot of the steps, flanked by Samuel Hartley and 4 other men, including Jenkins and Dawson, the Union veterans. All carried weapons, rifles or revolvers, held casually but visibly. "Evening, Beckett," Reed said, touching the brim of his hat. "Got a situation here I need to address." Thomas remained on the top step, keeping his hands visible. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Mr. Hartley here has raised serious concerns about your activities. Practicing medicine without a territorial license is a crime. So is impersonating a qualified physician." "I am a qualified physician, Sheriff. My training at Jefferson Medical College was completed before the war." "A Confederate officer," Hartley interjected, his voice carrying to the small crowd that had begun to gather. "A man who betrayed his own side by aiding the enemy. A man who has deceived this entire town about his identity and qualifications." Thomas kept his voice level. "I've hidden my past, yes. After the war, I found that people were more interested in which uniform I wore than in my skills as a doctor. But I have never misrepresented my medical training or knowledge." "That's for a court to decide," Sheriff Reed said, sounding uncomfortable with his role. "Judge Whitmore being ill, we'll need to hold you until a circuit judge can hear the case. Could be a few weeks." "And in the meantime," Thomas gestured toward the church behind him, "there are dozens of seriously ill people in there who need medical attention. Dr. Miller can't treat them all." That's unfortunate, Hartley said with false sympathy, but the law must be upheld. We can't allow an unverified practitioner to experiment on the townspeople, particularly not someone whose loyalty to the union is questionable. Thomas felt a cold anger rising, but kept it carefully contained. This isn't about the law, Mr. Hartley. It's about your wounded pride because Charlotte chose me over you. It's about maintaining your position of influence in this town. Hartley's handsome face flushed. How dare you, Samuel Hartley? The voice came from the church doors where Charlotte now stood, her posture rigid with anger. Is this how you respond to a town in crisis? By removing the one person who's actually helping? Charlotte, this is not your concern, Hartley began. It is entirely my concern when my husband is being threatened and my neighbors are at risk of dying from lack of treatment. She descended the steps to stand beside Thomas. Sheriff Reed, my father is inside seriously ill with typhoid fever. Dr. Beckett is treating him at my father's own consent, I might add. Would you remove the physician currently keeping the territorial judge alive? Reed shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, I understand your position, but there are laws. Laws, my father would be the first to temporarily suspend in a public health emergency. Charlotte interrupted. You know this, Sheriff. In crisis situations, the territorial code allows for provisional authorization of medical practitioners when insufficient care is available. Thomas glanced at her, surprised by her knowledge of territorial law. Charlotte met his gaze briefly, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. She had been reading more than medical texts during their evenings at home. That's a matter for legal interpretation, Hartley said dismissively. In the absence of the judge, the sheriff must maintain order according to established procedure. Then arrest my husband after the epidemic is contained, Charlotte challenged, after all the sick are treated, after my father is well enough to preside over whatever case you wish to bring. She stepped closer to Hartley, her voice dropping. Unless, of course, you'd prefer Judge Whitmore didn't recover. That would certainly make your path to influence in this town smoother. Hartley recoiled as if slapped. That's an outrageous accusation. Is it? You've been surprisingly eager to remove the doctor treating him. Charlotte turned to address the gathering crowd. My husband has been caring for many of you in secret for months. Now he's doing so openly because the need is too great to hide. Are you willing to lose that care because of old hatreds and wounded pride? A murmur ran through the onlookers. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward again. My brother would have lost his leg if not for Dr. Beckett's skill. I say let him work. Isaiah Washington joined her. My boy's fever broke an hour ago. Doc said he's past the worst of it. Who else gonna help our children if he's locked up? More voices joined in support, not everyone, but enough to make Sheriff Reed look increasingly uncomfortable with his position. He glanced at Hartley, then back at Thomas and Charlotte. Perhaps a temporary arrangement could be made, for the duration of the emergency only. Hartley's face darkened with fury. This is absurd. You're allowing sentiment to override legal procedure. I'm prioritizing lives over technicalities, Samuel, Reed replied with sudden firmness. My own daughter's in that church with fever. If Beckett can help her, I don't give a damn what uniform he wore 8 years ago. The tide had turned. Hartley could see it in the faces around him, in the sheriff's resolute expression, in the determined stance of the woman he had once thought to make his wife. He stepped back, his voice cold with controlled rage. Very well, but this isn't finished, Beckett. When the crisis passes, there will be a reckoning. There always is, Thomas replied quietly. But for now, I have patients to attend. He turned to re-enter the church, Charlotte at his side. As they reached the doors, a commotion from inside drew their attention, running footsteps, a cry of alarm. Reverend Walsh appeared, his face ashen. "Dr. Beckett, come quickly. It's the judge. He's taken a turn for the worse. He's struggling to breathe." Thomas was already moving Charlotte close behind. They rushed through the church to the small study where Judge Whitmore lay. One glance confirmed the Reverend's assessment. The judge's breathing was labored, his skin flushed with fever, his eyes unfocused. "Intestinal hemorrhage," Thomas said tersely, noting the bloody discharge on the bedsheets. "It's a common complication of severe typhoid." He began examining the judge methodically, his expression grave. "Charlotte, I need the surgical kit, and as much clean linen as you can find. Now." As she hurried to gather the supplies, Thomas leaned close to the judge. "Sir, you're very ill. The infection has caused bleeding in your intestines. I may need to operate to save your life. Do you understand?" Judge Whitmore's eyes focused briefly, recognition flickering. "My daughter," he whispered hoarsely. "Where is Charlotte?" "Here, Father," Charlotte said, returning with the requested items. She took his hand, her voice steady despite her fear. "I'm right here." "If I don't survive this," the judge began. "You will survive," Charlotte said firmly. "Thomas is the best surgeon either of us will ever know. Trust him, Father, as I do." The judge's gaze shifted to Thomas, decades of prejudice warring with the primal human desire to live. "Do what you must, Beckett," he managed. "Save me, if you can." Thomas nodded once, already preparing for the most difficult surgery he had performed since the war, one that might save his most powerful enemy, or forever brand him as the man who failed to save Judge Whitmore. Outside the church, unnoticed in the commotion, Samuel Hartley mounted his horse and rode hard toward the edge of town, where a group of rough-looking men waited with rifles and torches. The emergency might have granted Thomas Beckett a temporary reprieve, but Samuel Hartley was a man who believed in creating his own justice when legal means failed him. The makeshift operating room in Reverend Walsh's study was lit by a dozen oil lamps, their golden light casting long shadows across the walls. Thomas Beckett worked with the intense focus of a man for whom surgery was not just a skill, but a calling. His hands moved with practiced precision as he fought to repair the intestinal hemorrhage threatening Judge Whitmore's life. Charlotte stood at his side assistant and witness to this desperate battle. She passed instruments, sponged away blood, and monitored the judge's breathing with unwavering concentration. The man on the table was no longer just her stern father, but a patient whose life hung by the thinnest of threads. "Suture," Thomas said quietly, his voice calm, despite the gravity of the situation. Charlotte placed the curved needle in his palm, watching as he closed the tear in the intestinal wall with stitches so fine they were barely visible. Outside the small study, the church remained filled with typhoid patients, their needs temporarily overseen by volunteers following Thomas's instructions. The epidemic had not paused for one man's crisis, not even the judge's. "Bleeding's controlled," Thomas murmured more to himself than to Charlotte. "Now we need to irrigate the peritoneal cavity to prevent infection." He glanced up, meeting her eyes briefly. "You're doing well. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she replied automatically, though fatigue dragged at her limbs and fear for her father clouded her thoughts. "What are his chances?" Thomas didn't soften the truth. "Guarded. The fever weakened him significantly before the hemorrhage. The next 24 hours will tell." He returned his attention to his work methodically cleaning the surgical field. "I've seen men survive worse on the battlefield, but he's older, less resilient." Judge Whitmore lay unconscious, his imposing frame rendered vulnerable by illness and surgery. His face, usually set in stern lines of authority, now appeared merely old, the deep creases speaking of a life spent in judgment rather than joy. "He was different once," Charlotte said softly as they began closing the incision. "Before my mother's miscarriages, before the war. He used to laugh." Thomas nodded without looking up. "War changes men. Some harden, some break. Some find a middle path." The last suture went in neat and precise. "There. We've done what we can surgically. Now it's a matter of fighting infection and supporting his recovery." They bandaged the wound and moved the judge to a clean bed. Thomas checked his vital signs once more, his expression grave, but not hopeless. Someone should stay with him constantly. Any change in breathing, any new bleeding, I need to know immediately. "I'll stay," Charlotte said, settling into a chair beside her father's bed. "You're needed for the other patients." Thomas studied her face, noting the shadows under her eyes, the strain in her posture. "You need rest, Charlotte. You've been working as long as I have. I'll rest here." Her tone brooked no argument. "He's my father, Thomas." He recognized the determination in her voice, the same resolve that had led her to refuse Samuel Hartley to join him in treating patients, despite the risks to stand beside him against the sheriff. With a slight nod, he accepted her decision. "Call for me if anything changes. I'll check on him hourly." As Thomas stepped back into the main church, he was met by Sheriff Reed, whose expression carried a new gravity. "How's the judge?" Reed asked quietly. "Stable for now. The surgery went as well as could be expected, but he's still critical." Reed nodded, then glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "There's something you should know, Beckett. Hartley left town about an hour ago with Jenkins Dawson and some rough characters I don't recognize. Headed west toward your homestead." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "You're certain?" "My deputy saw them, armed carrying torches." Reed shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I know we've had our differences, but burning a man's home while he's saving lives? That ain't right." "Thank you for the warning," Thomas said, his mind already calculating options, none of them good. His home, their home, represented everything he and Charlotte had built together. The medical supplies hidden beneath the floorboards, the books and instruments, the simple security they had created. "I'd send men to stop them, but with the sickness," Reed gestured helplessly at the rows of patients. "Most of my deputies are down with fever or caring for family." "I understand." Thomas's voice was level, betraying none of his inner turmoil. "The patients here take priority." Reed hesitated, then offered his hand. "For what it's worth, what you did for my daughter, for all these folks, well, a man's actions speak louder than his past allegiances." Thomas took the offered hand, recognizing the significance of the gesture from a Union-loyal sheriff to a former Confederate officer. "Thank you, Sheriff." After Reed departed, Thomas stood motionless for a moment, weighing his responsibilities. Patients filled the church, many still in critical condition, requiring his constant attention. Judge Whitmore balanced on the knife edge between life and death. Yet his home, and everything it contained, was under imminent threat. "Dr. Beckett." The voice belonged to Mrs. Patterson, who approached with a cup of coffee. "You look troubled. More than usual, I mean." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully. "Sheriff Reed just informed me that Samuel Hartley and some men are headed for my homestead, with torches." Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened. "That miserable, vindictive—" She stopped herself. "What will you do? What I can. The patients come first." He took a sip of the bitter coffee, letting it fortify him. "But I need to warn Charlotte, and perhaps there may be a way to protect what matters most. You go speak to Charlotte. I'll watch your patients for a few minutes." Mrs. Patterson straightened her apron with determined hands. "And then I'm sending my brother Caleb and some friends to your place. Hartley may have his cronies, but he's not the only one with allies in Prosperity Creek." Thomas's surprise must have shown on his face, for Mrs. Patterson smiled grimly. "This town's changing, Dr. Beckett. Some of us remember what it was like before men like Hartley and even Judge Whitmore came with their rigid ideas about who matters and who doesn't. Some of us would like to see a different Prosperity Creek emerge from this crisis." He studied her face, seeing the resolve behind her motherly exterior. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I won't forget this." When Thomas entered the small study where Charlotte kept vigil, she immediately tensed at his expression. "What's happened? Is it another patient?" "Your father's stable," he reassured her quickly. "But Sheriff Reed just informed me that Samuel Hartley has gathered some men and is headed for our homestead, with torches." Charlotte paled, one hand instinctively reaching for her father's, as if seeking an anchor. "He means to burn our home, because you wouldn't be arrested. More likely because you chose to stand with me publicly. Hartley strikes me as a man who doesn't accept rejection well." Thomas moved closer, keeping his voice low. "I don't want to alarm you, but there's something you should know. Beneath the floorboards under our bed, there's more than just medical supplies. There are documents, my military records letters from patients on both sides of the war journals that could clear my name with the proper authorities." "Your proof of innocence," Charlotte said, understanding dawning. "If Hartley destroys those, then I remain forever the disgraced Confederate surgeon with no way to officially practice medicine again." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "But I can't leave the patients, and your father needs you here," she finished, conflict clear in her eyes. "Our home or my father's life? What kind of choice is that?" "No choice at all. I stay." Thomas's voice was firm. "Mrs. Patterson is sending some men to try to protect the homestead, but I don't know if they'll arrive in time." Charlotte stood suddenly, decision made. "I'll go." "Charlotte, no. It's too dangerous. Hartley is unpredictable, and the men with him won't expect me," she interrupted. "They'll be watching for you or the sheriff's men. A woman might slip through." She glanced at her father's unconscious form. "He's stable for now. You said so yourself. And you'll be here with him." Thomas shook his head, concern evident in his expression. "It's 8 miles to the homestead. By the time you arrive, I'm an excellent rider, Thomas. Faster than most men if I don't have to maintain appearances." There was a determination in her eyes that brooked no argument. "Those documents are your future, our future. The chance to practice medicine openly without hiding. I won't let Hartley steal that from us." The "us" hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither had explicitly acknowledged until now. They had begun as strangers forced together, become reluctant allies, then partners in their clandestine medical work. But somewhere along the way, something deeper had taken root, a connection built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and growing affection. "Be careful," Thomas finally said, recognizing that he could not stop her and, perhaps, should not. Charlotte Beckett was no fragile flower to be protected, but a woman of courage and conviction who made her own choices. "Take the Winchester rifle from the church office. Reverend Walsh keeps it for emergencies." "I won't have to use it," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I'll get the documents and return before dawn." She hesitated, then impulsively leaned forward and pressed her lips to his cheek. "Keep my father alive, Thomas. No matter what happens, don't leave his side." The unexpected gesture left him momentarily speechless. By the time he recovered, Charlotte was already gathering her riding skirt and moving purposefully toward the door. "Charlotte," he called softly. She paused, looking back. The mare responds better if you give her her head on the open stretches. She knows the way home. A smile touched her lips, understanding his implicit permission and concern. I know. You taught me well. Then she was gone, slipping through the church like a determined spirit. Thomas stood alone in the quiet room, the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. He turned back to Judge Whitmore, checking his pulse and breathing with automatic precision. You raised a remarkable daughter, sir, he murmured to the unconscious man. Far stronger than either of us deserves. The night air carried the metallic edge of approaching rain as Charlotte urged the chestnut mare westward away from town. She rode astride rather than side-saddle her split riding skirt, allowing the freedom of movement necessary for speed. The Winchester rifle was secured in a scabbard beside the saddle, its weight both reassuring and frightening. Lightning flickered on the distant horizon, briefly illuminating the rolling prairie. The storm would reach them by morning, washing away the dust of summer's early days, perhaps cleansing more than just the land. Charlotte found herself thinking of baptism, of rebirth, of the strange journey that had brought her from privileged daughter to frontier doctor's wife to this moment racing through the night to save the future she had never imagined wanting. 3 miles from town, she reined the mare to a walk, listening intently. The night held many sounds, the whisper of wind through prairie grass, the distant yip of coyotes, the creak of leather as the horse moved. But there, just ahead, came another sound, men's voices, the clink of metal, the distinctive snort of horses. Charlotte guided the mare off the trail, moving silently through the tall grass, until she could make out the source of the sounds. A group of riders had stopped at a crossroads, dark silhouettes against the night sky. She recognized Samuel Hartley's voice giving directions. Jenkins, you and Dawson circle around from the north. Carson, take your men up the creek bed. If Beckett somehow got wind of this and left the town, he'll likely approach from the east. I want him intercepted. And if the woman's there? Asked a gruff voice Charlotte didn't recognize. Mrs. Beckett is not to be harmed, Hartley replied, a possessive edge in his voice that made Charlotte's skin crawl. She's confused, misled by Beckett's manipulations. When this is over, she'll understand it was for the best. What exactly are we doing here, Hartley? This voice belonged to Dawson, slurred with what was likely whiskey. Burning a man's home is serious business, even a Reb's. We're protecting this town from a dangerous fraud, Hartley said smoothly. A man who deceived us all, who's practicing medicine without proper authority, who even now has the judge's life in his unqualified hand. Think of it as preventative justice. The men muttered among themselves, some sounding less convinced than others. Charlotte held her breath, calculating. There appeared to be at least 8 men armed and spread out to approach the homestead from multiple directions. She couldn't outride them all, and a direct confrontation would be suicidal. But she knew this land better than they did. 3 months of riding with Thomas to treat patients in outlying areas had taught her every creek and ridge, every hidden approach to their cabin. There was a way dangerous, but possible. As the men separated and continued toward the homestead, Charlotte guided the mare in a wide circle to the south, where the land dropped away into a series of shallow ravines. In daylight, no horse could navigate them safely. In darkness, with a storm approaching, the attempt was near madness. But the mare was sure-footed, and Charlotte was desperate. "Easy, girl," she murmured, loosening the reins as Thomas had taught her. "You know the way." The descent into the first ravine was heart-stopping, the mare sliding more than walking down the steep incline. Charlotte leaned back in the saddle, balancing her weight to help the horse maintain footing. At the bottom, They splashed through a shallow creek, then began the arduous climb up the other side. By the time they emerged from the third ravine, Charlotte's muscles ached from tension, and her clothes were damp with nervous sweat, despite the cool night air. But they had gained precious ground. The lights of the homestead were visible now, a welcoming glow in the darkness. No other riders were in sight, but columns of dust to the east and north told her that Hartley's men were converging rapidly. She had perhaps 10 minutes' advantage, no more. The mare, sensing home, quickened her pace without urging. They crossed the last stretch of open ground at a gallop. Charlotte bent low over the horse's neck. As they approached the cabin, she saw with relief that it stood intact, no sign yet of Hartley's justice. She dismounted quickly, securing the mare at the hitching post rather than taking time to stable her properly. "Sorry, girl," she murmured, patting the horse's sweaty neck. "I'll make it up to you." Inside the cabin was exactly as they had left it that morning, a lifetime ago it seemed. Charlotte moved swiftly to the bedroom, kneeling to pry up the loose floorboards beneath the bed. The hidden compartment Thomas had built revealed its treasures, a metal strongbox containing his military papers and personal documents, a smaller wooden case of surgical instruments too valuable to leave exposed, and a canvas sack of emergency medicines. She had just secured the last item when she heard the approaching riders. No time for subtlety now. Charlotte grabbed the Winchester, checked that it was loaded, and moved to the window. In the faint moonlight breaking through clouds, she could make out at least 6 men approaching from different directions, Hartley in the lead. They had not expected to find anyone at the cabin. That much was clear from their casual approach, their lack of stealth. Charlotte could use that surprise to her advantage, but how? She was outnumbered, outgunned. A strategy formed in her mind, desperate, perhaps foolhardy, but the only option that might work. Quickly, she positioned the strongbox and other valuables near the rear door, ready for a swift escape. Then she moved to the front of the cabin and, taking a deep breath, stepped onto the porch with the rifle held ready, but not aimed. "That's far enough, gentlemen," she called, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. The riders pulled up sharply, hands instinctively moving to weapons before registering who addressed them. "Charlotte." Samuel Hartley's voice held surprise and something like pleasure. "What are you doing here? You should be with your father." "My father is in good hands," she replied steadily. "I came to protect my home." Hartley urged his horse forward, stopping at the edge of the yard. The other men remained slightly behind, uncertain of this new development. "Your home, this rebel's shack." "Charlotte, you can't be serious. This situation is temporary, an unfortunate necessity created by your father's poor judgment." "My father made many mistakes, Samuel. Refusing your suit for me wasn't one of them." Charlotte kept the rifle visible, but not threatening. "I know why you're here. To destroy our home, to burn the evidence of Thomas's innocence, to ensure he can never practice medicine legally again." "Innocence?" Hartley scoffed. "The man was court-martialed by his own side for treason." "For treating wounded soldiers regardless of their uniform," she corrected. "The same way he's treating everyone in town now, regardless of their wealth or color or politics." She nodded toward the strongbox visible through the open door. "I have the proof right there. Documents that would clear his name with the Territorial Medical Board. Testimonials from soldiers, Union soldiers, whose lives he saved." A flicker of genuine alarm crossed Hartley's handsome face. "You're being naive, Charlotte. Beckett has manipulated you, used you to gain respectability. When this epidemic passes, things will return to normal. Your father will annul this farce of a marriage, and you'll return to your proper place in society." "My proper place," Charlotte allowed her anger to show now, As your wife, you mean the silent, obedient Mrs. Hartley, turning a blind eye to your cruelty, your prejudice. I've found my place, Samuel. It's beside a man who treats all people with dignity, who uses his skills to heal rather than his position to dominate. Hartley's expression hardened. I see he's quite thoroughly corrupted you with his rebel sentiments. Equal treatment for all, regardless of natural station or color. Next, you'll be advocating voting rights for Negroes and women. Perhaps I will. Charlotte adjusted her grip on the rifle, aware of the men shifting restlessly behind Hartley. Now I suggest you and your friends leave. This is my property, and you're trespassing. A cold smile spread across Hartley's face. Your property, my dear, nothing here belongs to you. Your father's dowry paid for this land. By territorial law, it belongs to your husband, a man currently practicing medicine illegally, who may well face imprisonment. When that happens, who do you think the bank will recognize as having the primary claim? He gestured expansively. This land adjoins my eastern pasture quite nicely. I've had my eye on it for some time. Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Hartley had planned this carefully, not just revenge, but acquisition. Thomas's imprisonment would leave the homestead vulnerable, the mortgage unpaid. Hartley, with his banking connections, would swoop in to claim it all. You won't imprison my husband, she said, forcing confidence into her voice. Not with half the town owing their lives to him. Not with my father recovering under his care. The people of Prosperity Creek have seen Thomas's true character now, and yours as well. Hartley's smile faded, replaced by cold calculation. People's memories are short, Charlotte. When the crisis passes, old prejudices will resurface. The rebel doctor will become an uncomfortable reminder of disorder, of boundaries crossed. Order will reassert itself. He gestured to the men behind him. Jenkins Dawson, search the cabin. Bring out any documents you find. Don't move, Charlotte warned, raising the rifle to her shoulder now. I know how to use this. You won't shoot me, Charlotte, Hartley said with smug certainty. You don't have it in you. Perhaps not, came a new voice from the darkness to their left. But I surely do. All heads turned to see Isaiah Washington step from the shadows, a shotgun cradled in his arms. He was not alone. Behind him emerged Caleb Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's brother, and 3 other men from town, shopkeepers and farmers Charlotte recognized as patients Thomas had treated. Evening, Mr. Hartley, Caleb said, his voice deceptively casual. Bit late for a social call, ain't it? Hartley's face darkened with fury. What is the meaning of this? How dare you interfere in business that doesn't concern you? Seems to me burning down a neighbor's home concerns the whole community, Caleb replied. Especially when that neighbor's saving lives while you're out here planning arson. The balance of power had shifted palpably. Hartley's men outnumbered the defenders, but not by much, and the element of surprise was lost. A tense silence fell, broken only by the distant rumble of approaching thunder. This isn't over, Hartley said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage. There are proper channels for dealing with frauds and traitors. The territorial authorities have bigger concerns than a doctor who treats everyone regardless of their ability to pay. Interrupted a new arrival. Sheriff Reed rode into the yard, 2 deputies flanking him. Like men who gather armed posses to burn homesteads in the night. Hartley's composure finally cracked. This is absurd. I am a respected businessman, a Union veteran. You can't possibly be taking the side of a Confederate surgeon and his misled wife. I'm taking the side of law and order, Mr. Hartley, Reed replied calmly. And right now, you and your friends are disturbing the peace during a public health emergency. He nodded toward the horizon. Storm's coming. I suggest everyone go home, cool off. Any grievances can be addressed through proper legal channels once the epidemic is contained. Charlotte watched the fury and calculation war in Hartley's expression. Finally, practicality won. With a curt nod, he reined his horse around. This matter isn't concluded, Sheriff. The Territorial Medical Board will hear about Beckett's illegal practice, and Judge Whitmore will recover eventually. I certainly hope he does, Reed replied evenly. I imagine he'll be mighty interested to hear how you spent the night his daughter was saving his life. Hartley had no answer for that. With a last venomous glance at Charlotte, he spurred his horse away, his reluctant followers trailing behind him. When they had gone, Charlotte lowered the rifle, her hands shaking with the aftermath of tension. "Thank you," she said to the unexpected allies gathered in her yard. "You risked much to come here tonight." "Not nearly as much as you and the doctor risk every day," Isaiah Washington replied, his dignity untouched by the confrontation. "My boy's alive because of you both. That creates a debt that can't be measured." Sheriff Reed dismounted, approaching Charlotte with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Mrs. Beckett, I came as soon as Mrs. Patterson told me what was happening. Your husband asked me to escort you back to town if you wished." He hesitated. "There's news about your father." Charlotte's heart seized. "What news? Has he regained consciousness about an hour ago," Reed said quickly. "Dr. Beckett says he's not out of danger, but it's a positive sign. He's been asking for you." Relief flooded through her, followed by renewed determination. "I need to return immediately." She turned to Caleb Patterson. "Mr. Patterson, could I impose on you and your friends to secure the homestead? There are documents here that could clear my husband's name, proof of his medical training and honorable service." "We'll guard it with our lives, Mrs. Beckett," Caleb assured her. "No one will touch your home while we're here." Charlotte nodded gratefully, then hurried to collect the strongbox and other valuables she had prepared for escape. The most crucial documents, those that proved Thomas's medical credentials and the true nature of his court-martial, she secured inside her bodice. Whatever happened, those would remain with her. As she mounted the mare once more, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pattering on the cabin roof like a blessing. The storm that had threatened all night was finally breaking, perhaps washing away more than dust from the parched land. Sheriff Reed and his deputies flanked her as they rode toward town, their horses' hooves splashing through puddles that grew with each passing minute. Lightning split the sky, followed by booming thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. The mare remained steady, undisturbed by the elements. Like her rider, Charlotte thought, who had also found unexpected steadiness in the midst of life's storms. The rain fell harder as they approached Prosperity Creek, drenching them despite their slickers. By the time they reached the church, it was coming down in sheets, turning the streets to mud and washing away the miasma of sickness that had hung over the town. Thomas was waiting on the church steps, his tall figure immediately recognizable even in the downpour. Charlotte dismounted before Sheriff Reed could assist her, hurrying up the steps with the strongbox clutched to her chest. "You're safe," Thomas said, relief evident in his voice. His hands moved instinctively to check her for injury, then stopped, remembering their audience. "I was worried when the storm broke." Hartley and his men came, but Sheriff Reed and others arrived in time. She pushed wet hair from her face, searching his expression. "My father. Conscious, weak, but lucid. His fever's broken." Thomas took the strongbox from her arms. "He's been asking for you. And for me, surprisingly." Charlotte felt a surge of hope. Both of us. Together. "So it seems." Thomas glanced at the sheriff and deputies who were securing the horses. "Did you secure the documents?" In answer, Charlotte reached into her bodice and withdrew the oilskin packet containing his most crucial papers. The originals are here. Copies in the strongbox, along with your other possessions. Mr. Patterson and others are guarding the homestead. Thomas stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Admiration, certainly, but something deeper as well. Charlotte, what you did tonight was no more than what you do every day, she interrupted gently. Now shall we see what my father wants with both of us? Whatever it is, I suspect it will change everything. Thomas nodded, and together they entered the church, leaving muddy footprints on the worn wooden floor. The rain continued to fall outside, cleansing the land, perhaps washing away old hatreds to make room for new beginnings. In the small study at the back of the church, Judge Harrison Whitmore waited, his imposing frame diminished by illness, but his eyes as sharp as ever. The confrontation that awaited would determine not just their future, but perhaps the soul of Prosperity Creek itself. Judge Harrison Whitmore lay propped against pillows, his once commanding presence diminished by illness, yet not extinguished. His silver hair lay damp against his forehead, and the lines in his face seemed deeper, as if the typhoid had carved new channels of age overnight. But his eyes, those penetrating gray eyes that had caused countless witnesses to falter on the stand, remained clear and alert. He watched silently as Charlotte and Thomas entered the small study, both still damp from the storm raging outside. Lightning flashed through the single window, briefly illuminating their faces, his daughter chin high with a newfound confidence. Her husband standing straight but wary like a soldier anticipating inspection by a superior officer. "You look like drowned rats, the pair of you," the judge said, his voice weaker than before, but carrying the same dry authority. Charlotte moved immediately to his bedside, taking his hand. "Father, how are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo, then stitched back together by a Confederate surgeon." Despite the words, there was no venom in his tone, perhaps even the ghost of humor, which I suppose is precisely what happened. Thomas remained by the door, medical assessment automatic, as he studied his patient. "Your color is better, sir, and your breathing seems less labored. How is the pain?" "Considerable," the judge admitted, "but manageable. Your Frontier whiskey makes an effective medicine, Beckett." "I've found it has multiple applications, sir." Thomas's voice remained professionally neutral, giving nothing away. Judge Whitmore shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. "Sheriff Reed informed me of tonight's events before he left to find you, Charlotte. He seemed to think Samuel Hartley intended harm to your home." Charlotte exchanged a glance with Thomas before responding. "Yes, Father. Samuel gathered men to burn our homestead and destroy evidence of Thomas's medical qualifications. Evidence which you risked your life to retrieve." It wasn't a question. The judge's eyes moved to the oilskin packet and strongbox Charlotte had placed on a nearby table. "May I see these documents Hartley was so eager to eliminate?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Charlotte brought the oilskin packet to her father, opening it carefully. Inside lay Thomas's medical school diploma from Jefferson College, his commission as a captain in the Confederate Medical Corps, letters from commanding officers praising his skill, and most significantly, testimonials from Union soldiers he had treated describing his care and dedication regardless of uniform. The judge examined each document meticulously, his judicial mind evaluating their authenticity. Finally, he looked up at Thomas. "You were court-martialed for treating Union wounded with the same priority as Confederate." "Yes, sir." And Thomas moved closer, standing beside Charlotte now. "I refused to prioritize treatment based on uniform. My oath as a physician superseded my commission as an officer." An oath you've continued to honor, it seems, even when it cost you everything. The judge's gaze was evaluative, but no longer hostile. Sheriff Reed tells me half the town is alive because of your care during this epidemic, that you've been treating the poor and colored folks all along in secret. Not entirely in secret, sir. Your daughter has been my assistant and student these past weeks. She has a natural aptitude for medicine. Judge Whitmore's eyebrows rose as he turned to Charlotte. Is this true? You've been practicing medicine alongside your husband. Charlotte straightened, prepared for condemnation, but unwilling to deny the work that had come to define her. Yes, Father. Thomas has taught me diagnosis treatment, even surgical assistance. I was with him during your operation. A complex emotion crossed the judge's face. Surprise, disapproval, but also something like reluctant admiration. Your mother always said you were meant for more than simply being some man's ornamental wife. I never listened. The admission hung in the air, unexpected, and waited with meaning. Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. Mother taught me to value knowledge above decoration, compassion above position. Elizabeth was wiser than I gave her credit for. The judge closed his eyes briefly, fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. When I posted that notice, condemning you to marriage with the first man who claimed you, I intended it as punishment for your defiance, for embarrassing me before the town's finest citizens. I know, Father. It was cruel. He continued the words, seeming to cost him. Beneath the dignity of a father, a judge. But I was blinded by pride and old prejudices. He opened his eyes again, looking directly at Thomas. I selected you specifically, Beckett, when I learned you were Southern. I thought giving Charlotte to a former Confederate a stable hand would break her spirit and teach her to value the position she'd thrown away. I gathered as much, sir, Thomas replied, his voice level. Instead, the judge continued, I inadvertently gave her to perhaps the only man in the territory who would respect her mind, encourage her abilities, and treat her as a partner rather than a possession. A faint, rueful smile touched his lips. My punishment became her liberation. There's a lesson in irony there that would not be lost on Solomon himself. Charlotte squeezed her father's hand, hardly believing what she was hearing. Father, are you saying— I'm saying that I've been wrong, Charlotte, about many things. His gaze moved between her and Thomas, including the value of a man's character over his origins or allegiances in a war that should be behind us. He addressed Thomas directly now. You saved my life tonight, Beckett. You could have let me die. God knows I gave you reason enough, but you fought for me with the same dedication you showed to every patient in that church. I took an oath, sir, Thomas said simply. It doesn't have exceptions for difficult fathers-in-law. The ghost of a smile touched the judge's mouth. Indeed. He gestured toward the documents. These would clear your name with the Territorial Medical Board, allow you to practice legally, openly. That was my hope, yes. Judge Whitmore nodded, slowly, decision forming. When I am recovered enough to sit in my official capacity, I will convene a hearing. These documents will be entered into evidence, along with testimony from those you've treated during this crisis. I will personally recommend to the territorial governor that you receive full medical licensure. Charlotte caught her breath, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Father, do you mean it? I've never been one to make idle promises, Charlotte, as you well know. The judge shifted again, grimacing at the pain the movement caused. This town needs a proper doctor, one who treats all patients, not just those who can pay. And you, it seems, need a proper assistant. His stern gaze softened slightly. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, even if your path is unconventional. Emotion threatened to overwhelm Charlotte. After months of estrangement, years of failing to meet her father's expectations, this acknowledgement, however qualified, meant more than she could express. "Thank you, Father," she managed, her voice thick. "Don't thank me yet," the judge warned. "Samuel Hartley has powerful connections in the territory. His father holds the mortgage on half the businesses in town, including Henderson's livery. There will be resistance to Beckett's formal recognition." He looked at Thomas. "Are you prepared for that fight, Captain?" Thomas stood straighter, the military title triggering old reflexes. "I've faced worse odds, sir, and I'll have better allies this time." His hand moved to rest lightly on Charlotte's shoulder, a gesture of partnership that spoke volumes. "Indeed, you will." The judge's eyes grew heavy, fatigue claiming him. "Now I believe I require rest. The two of you should do the same. I suspect the coming days will demand all our strength." As they left the small study, Charlotte felt lightheaded with exhaustion and cautious hope. Thomas guided her to a quiet corner of the church, where volunteers had arranged blankets for those working through the night. "You should sleep," he said gently. "You've been awake for nearly 2 days." "So have you." She studied his face, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw. "Do you believe him that he'll help secure your medical license?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I believe he's a man reassessing his life and values while facing his own mortality. Whether that change persists when he returns to health and power," he shrugged slightly. "We'll see." "He's stubborn," Charlotte said. "Once he commits to a course, he rarely deviates." "A family trait, it seems." Thomas's mouth curved in a faint smile. Charlotte felt an answering smile touch her lips, despite her exhaustion. "Perhaps, though in my case, it led me to defy him rather than emulate him, for which I am profoundly grateful." His voice had softened green eyes, holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Without your defiance, I would never have known the partnership we've built." The word partnership hung between them, accurate yet somehow insufficient to describe what had developed. They had begun as strangers thrust together by circumstance, evolved into allies in their secret medical work, and now stood on the threshold of something deeper. A connection forged through shared purpose and mutual respect that had gradually, inevitably bloomed into genuine affection. "Rest," Thomas said, breaking the moment. "I'll wake you if there's any change in your father's condition." Charlotte nodded, suddenly too exhausted to argue. She settled onto the makeshift pallet, pulling a blanket over herself. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Thomas moving back toward the rows of patients, his tall figure silhouetted against the lamplight, steady and dependable as the sunrise. The storm that had broken over Prosperity Creek proved to be a turning point in more ways than one. The heavy rains washed away weeks of accumulated dust, and perhaps the invisible miasma that many still believed carried disease. The town's water sources were flushed clean, and the creek that gave the settlement its name ran swift and clear again. Within days, the epidemic began to recede. New cases dwindled, and those already ill started to recover. The crisis that had threatened to devastate the small community gradually eased, leaving in its wake a changed landscape, both physical and social. 2 weeks after the night of surgery and storm, Thomas stood on the steps of the church watching as the last few patients well enough to travel returned to their homes. Inside, only a handful remained, those too weak for movement or without family to care for them. "Looks like we're finally winning," said Reverend Walsh, joining him on the steps. The minister had proved an unexpected ally, working tirelessly alongside Thomas and Charlotte, his initial prejudice against the rebel doctor transformed into respect. "The worst is past," Thomas agreed. though there will be lingering effects for some. Typhoid can leave lasting damage to the heart, intestines, even the brain in severe cases. Walsh nodded solemnly. I've been thinking about what comes next, Dr. Beckett. This church has served well as an emergency hospital, but the town needs something more permanent. A proper clinic open to all. Thomas glanced at him, surprised by the suggestion. That would require funding space equipment and a licensed physician. The funding might be manageable. The congregation has been discussing how to show proper gratitude for the lives saved. As for space, Walsh gestured to a small building adjacent to the church. The old Sunday school room has stood empty since we built the new one last year. With some renovation, it could serve. And the licensed physician. Thomas kept his tone carefully neutral, not yet ready to count on Judge Whitmore's promised support. I believe that matter is being addressed as we speak. Walsh nodded toward the courthouse across the town square, where a small crowd had gathered. The judge convened a special hearing this morning. First official business since his recovery began. Thomas felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. Despite the judge's words that night in the church study, he had learned through bitter experience not to count on promises made in moments of extremity. People recovered from illness. Old prejudices often proved more resilient than the body. You should be there, Walsh suggested. It concerns you directly after all. My place is with my patients, Thomas replied, though his eyes remained fixed on the distant courthouse. Charlotte is representing our interests. As if summoned by her name, Charlotte appeared at the courthouse door, her honey gold hair catching the sunlight as she hurried across the square toward the church. Even at a distance, Thomas could read excitement in her bearing, in the way she lifted her skirts to move more quickly. Thomas, she called as she neared, you need to come. Father has made his ruling, but he wants to deliver the final part with you present. Thomas hesitated, glancing back at the church where his remaining patients rested. Mrs. Patterson is with them, Charlotte assured him, reading his concern. They're all stable. This won't take long, but it's important. The courthouse was filled beyond capacity when they arrived. It seemed half the town had turned out for the proceedings. Thomas noted the division in the crowd supporters on one side, including Isaiah Washington, Caleb Patterson, and many he had treated during the epidemic. Opponents on the other clustered around Samuel Hartley, whose handsome face wore an expression of barely contained fury. Judge Whitmore sat at his bench, still pale from his illness, but radiating the authority that had made him feared and respected throughout the territory. He wore his formal black robes, the visual symbol of his judicial power. As Thomas and Charlotte entered, he gestured them forward to stand before the bench. Captain Thomas Beckett, the judge began, his voice carrying clearly, despite its weakened state. This court has reviewed extensive evidence regarding your medical qualifications, military service, and recent contributions during the typhoid epidemic that struck our community. A murmur ran through the crowd. Thomas stood at attention, years of military discipline asserting themselves automatically. Beside him, Charlotte remained equally straight, her hand finding his and gripping it tightly. Testimonials have been heard from numerous citizens, including many who owe their lives or those of their loved ones to your care. The judge shuffled some papers before him. Documentation of your medical training at Jefferson College has been verified as authentic. Letters from both Confederate and Union officers attesting to your skill and ethical conduct as a surgeon have been entered into evidence. Thomas felt a cautious hope rising, but kept his expression neutral. He had been in courtrooms before where apparent victory had turned to devastating defeat in the final moments. This court also heard arguments against granting you medical licensure. Judge Whitmore continued, his gaze moving briefly to Samuel Hartley. Concerns were raised about your court-martial during the war Your practice of medicine without proper territorial authorization and allegations of stirring social unrest by treating all patients regardless of race or financial means. The judge's face gave nothing away as he continued. Having weighed all testimony and evidence, and in consideration of the extraordinary circumstances of recent weeks, this court rules as follows. The room fell silent, tension palpable as everyone waited for the verdict. Captain Thomas Becket is hereby granted provisional medical licensure for the territory of Wyoming with a recommendation to the governor for permanent status upon completion of 6 months probationary practice under this court's supervision. A cheer erupted from Thomas's supporters, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore continued when order was restored, in recognition of the pressing need demonstrated during the recent epidemic, this court authorizes the establishment of a public clinic in Prosperity Creek to be operated by Dr. Becket, with assistance from Mrs. Charlotte Becket, who has demonstrated remarkable aptitude and dedication. Charlotte's hand tightened around Thomas's, her breath catching at this unexpected validation of her own role. Initial funding for said clinic will come from fines levied against those who sought to obstruct medical care during the epidemic, or who engaged in vigilante actions against the person or property of a medical practitioner. The judge's steely gaze fixed directly on Samuel Hartley. Mr. Hartley, this court fines you $500 for organizing an armed party with intent to destroy property and evidence relevant to these proceedings. Said fine will be directed to the establishment of the clinic. Hartley surged to his feet, face flushed with rage. This is outrageous. You can't possibly— I can and have, Mr. Hartley. Judge Whitmore interrupted his voice, taking on the cold authority that had made him feared in his courtroom. Be grateful the charge isn't arson or attempted murder. Sheriff Reed provided quite detailed testimony about your actions that night. He banged his gavel once. This court's ruling is final. The clinic will open within 30 days with Dr. Becket as its chief physician. As the crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and protests, Charlotte turned to Thomas, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. It's real, she whispered. Everything we worked for, hoped for. Thomas could scarcely believe it himself. After years of hiding his skills of practicing in shadows and secrecy, he had been granted the right to heal openly to reclaim his identity as a physician. And Charlotte, whose intelligence and compassion had transformed their forced marriage into a true partnership, would work alongside him, her contributions formally recognized. As the courthouse emptied, Judge Whitmore approached them, moving slowly but steadily, his recovery progressing well under Thomas's care. Captain, or rather Dr. Becket, he said, extending his hand, I trust you'll uphold the highest standards of medical practice in your new clinic. Thomas shook the offered hand, feeling the significance of the gesture, not just legal authorization, but personal reconciliation. I will, sir, and I'll ensure Charlotte receives proper training to expand her skills. See that you do. The judge turned to his daughter. Your mother would have been proud, Charlotte. She always believed women's minds were as capable as men's, given proper education. Thank you, Father, Charlotte said softly, for everything. Judge Whitmore nodded, once his usual reserve returning after the momentary softening. There will still be opposition. Hartley and his allies won't accept this ruling easily. The clinic may face challenges, perhaps even danger. We're prepared for that, Thomas assured him. Change never comes without resistance. Indeed. The judge studied them both, something like grudging approval in his gaze. You make a formidable team, it seems. Perhaps my punishment served a greater purpose than I intended. With that, he turned and walked slowly back to his chambers, leaving Thomas and Charlotte standing in the emptying courthouse, the future suddenly open before them, in ways neither could have imagined when they had stood in this same building months ago, strangers being bound together by a judge's decree. The Prosperity Creek Medical Clinic opened its doors on a crisp autumn morning exactly 30 days after Judge Whitmore's ruling. The renovated Sunday school building had been transformed through the labor of many hands, Caleb Patterson and his friends rebuilding walls and floors, Isaiah Washington crafting shelves and cabinets of polished pine, Mrs. Patterson organizing the women of the town to sew curtains and bedding. The result was modest but functional, a waiting area, 2 examination rooms, a small surgery, and a dispensary stocked with medicines. Above the door hung a simple sign, Beckett Medical Clinic, all welcome. Thomas stood on the small porch watching as Charlotte directed the placement of the last few items, books on the shelves, instruments in their proper cabinets. She moved with confidence now, her knowledge growing daily through study and practice. The frightened young woman forced into marriage had blossomed into a skilled medical assistant with a healer's instincts and a reformer's heart. "Penny for your thoughts, doctor," she said, catching him watching her. "Just admiring the clinic and its assistant director." Thomas smiled, the expression coming more naturally to him these days. "Your father's punishment has had some unexpected consequences." Charlotte joined him on the porch, looking out over the town that had changed as much as they had over the past months. "The best kind of justice is when the sentence becomes a gift." She touched his arm lightly. "Though I don't think either of us saw it that way at first." "No," he agreed, covering her hand with his own. "But sometimes the most important diagnoses are the ones we miss initially." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the town went about its business. Prosperity Creek was changing slowly, but perceptibly. The rigid divisions of the immediate post-war years were beginning to soften. Isaiah Washington now worked openly as a carpenter, his skill recognized even by those who would never invite him into their homes. Judge Whitmore had begun reviewing old cases where justice might have been compromised by prejudice or politics. And Samuel Hartley had left town, his influence diminished by the judge's ruling and the community's shifting allegiances. He had sold his property to his father and departed for Denver, though rumors suggested he might return once the rebel doctor had failed a prospect that seemed increasingly unlikely as the clinic's reputation grew. "Our first patients will arrive soon," Charlotte reminded Thomas, bringing him back to the present. "Are you nervous?" "A bit," he admitted. "It's been a long time since I practiced medicine openly without looking over my shoulder." "You've been a doctor all along," she said firmly. "Now the rest of the world simply acknowledges what I've known since I found your medical books." Thomas turned to face her, fully struck again by how much had changed between them. What had begun as a marriage in name, only a punishment and a refuge, had evolved into something neither could have anticipated: a partnership in work, in purpose, in growing affection. "Charlotte," he began, then hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "These past months, working together, building this clinic, I've come to—" The words faltered, decades of restraint, making it difficult to express what had grown so naturally between them. Charlotte smiled, understanding in her eyes. "I know," she said simply. "I feel it too." She reached up and touched his face gently. "We began as strangers forced together, but we've chosen to remain together. That makes all the difference." Thomas covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm, a gesture far more intimate than the formal kiss on her knuckles at their wedding. "I never expected to find this again," he said quietly. "Purpose, belonging. After the war, I thought those things were lost to me forever." "And I never expected to find them at all," Charlotte replied. "My father thought he was sentencing me to a life of hardship and regret. Instead, he gave me the freedom to become who I was meant to be." In the distance, the church bell rang 9 o'clock time for the clinic to officially open. As if on cue, they saw Isaiah Washington approaching with a young boy who limped slightly, one of many children still recovering from the typhoid's lingering effects. "Ready, doctor?" Charlotte asked, straightening her apron. Thomas nodded, feeling a profound sense of rightness of coming full circle. "Ready, Mrs. Beckett." Together, they stepped forward to welcome their first official patients to the clinic that represented not just their professional future, but the healing of wounds far deeper than those that could be treated with medicine alone. The wounds of a divided nation, a divided town, and two souls who had found in each other the most unexpected of cures. As the morning sun rose higher over Prosperity Creek, casting long shadows behind the new clinic, Thomas thought of his father's inscription in the pocket watch he still carried. "To serve with honor is to live with honor." For the first time since the war had torn his world apart, he felt he was truly fulfilling that ideal, not on a battlefield trying to repair the damage of conflict, but in a frontier town, helping to build something new from the ashes of the old. And he was not doing it alone. The woman beside him, once a stranger thrust into his life by a judge's decree, had become the most essential part of his redemption. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, not as judge's daughter and stable hand, not as northerner and southerner, but as partners in the most meaningful work either could imagine: healing the body, the community, and perhaps in some small way the divided heart of America itself.